Okay, really quickly, I wanted to start out with the swimsuit and the solution to how to do the swimsuit. Alex, you start me a sign in, please. Thanks. So I'm not going to do this completely, but you can do this part with me. I'm going to go through this pretty quick. I think you will all get the idea once we start it. So if we take a look in your session 10, the first trick to doing this, if we look in your the assignment folder, so everybody knows what the challenge of all of this was, I'm going to select all of the files. So there were 5 raw files in there. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, there were 5 raw files in there. I have XMP files as well in this. You don't need to worry about selecting them. It would open them regardless. So I'm just going to hit Command O to open these up. And we'll start off in the very beginning again to color balance this. Now, in my case, because I've already done this before, it actually remembers the color balance. But you could have done a number of things on this if you were really motivated. So for instance, you have a color card in here. You could have created the custom color profile for this that I'm sure nobody in here did, but you could have done that. And that would have actually, again, in thinking about doing this work for yourself going forward, or doing this work as a professional retoucher or some hybrid of all of that, those things are all available to you. And again, if you say to, so for instance, I would say to somebody as a retoucher, you know, if this was the project that was presented to me and they say, okay, we need to smooth the swimsuit out, whatever, and I would see this thing, I would say, okay, I'm happy to do this for you, but to be perfectly honest with you, we really should do a custom color profile for this as well, and that's going to be extra $250. It takes you 5 minutes to build it, but they don't know that. And so they're like, okay, that sounds good to me. And you're off to the races, right? All of that. So anyway, I am going to do a custom color balance. So I'm going to just click on the eyedropper for the white balance part. I'm going to click on the version of this that's actually got the color card in it. It is the only thing I really want from this image. And again, because this image, she's actually turned out of the light, so none of those things are really going to help me in all of this. However, I want to apply this custom color balance first to everybody else. So to do that, once I've got the custom color balance done, I'm going to come up to the little 3 dots in the thumbnail, click on that and do a select all. So now all of my files, all the rest of them are selected, and then I'm going to go back to the same little 3 dots and click on the drop down and say I want you to sync these settings. The only thing we've done on this is actually done the white balance. So it's inside of the basic panel, which is completely selected. Just say okay. Now everybody in this is color balanced, but that's not far enough. I'm going to actually then go to the image that I want. So this is the one that we're supposed to be working on. And this was the first thing that I said to a number of, that I responded to a number of. If we take a zoom in here and take a look really closely, what you need to worry about, some and all the highlights that you see in here, is that in certain places we begin to lose texture. It's not the end of the world, but I'm thinking it would help if I could, like this area that's right below her boobs right here, this is pretty much blown out white. There's no texture left in it. So I'm going to see if I can't recover some of that texture first. So I'm only going to be working on the file that I ultimately want to be the one that I carry through all of this. I'm going to hit the auto button on here just to see what Photoshop thinks I should do. And Photoshop's take on this is that it actually feels like I'm underexposed, which I know I'm not. So, but at any rate, so the auto part did not work for me there. So I'm going to click auto to go to turn it back off to undo that part. And interestingly enough, it has not reset any of my values here. So yeah, I'm going to zero this back out. That was the problem. This was not zeroed out. My version of this was not zeroed out. It was already had the auto part on it. So you can see how much is blown out without the auto part selected on here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on auto again because that was part of the file that I opened up. However, I feel like I can recover more of these highlights. So I'm going to just grab my highlight slider and pull it down a little bit more, and I can probably zero out my exposure. It actually said that it wanted to add a half a stop of exposure for me. I'm just going to double click on that to zero that back out. And it makes the image considerably darker here now. So I've got a lot of highlight recovery. It's made it possibly a little bit too dark. So I'm going to split the difference and we'll say maybe a quarter of a stop. And this looks good to me. However, I need all of the other files to match this as well. So I'm just going to do that sync and the select all and sync process again. So I'm going to click again on my thumbnail, the little three dots, go to select all, it selects everybody, go back to those same little three dots and say sync settings, and I'm going to say OK to this. So it's going to resync everybody again, and I can continue to do this forever. But now I've got the 4 images that I really need to work with in Photoshop, and I can actually go from there. So to do that part, everybody is synced in here. I don't need the color card, so I'm going to select just the top image, hold down the Shift key, and select the bottom one. I just want to open the 4 files that have actually got content in it that I might use to do this. I am going to open them all as smart objects because we're going to do transforming in here that can be destructive in here. I can always rasterize once I get into Photoshop, but I might as well go in with the way my normal workflow would be. So I'm going to go ahead and say open objects. It'll hopefully open all 4 of these files. Yes? Did you select all of them and hit open? Then close the ones that you've got. Oh, you've got them open. It just didn't select all of them. So just click cancel out of here. Go back to the set and select all of them.
Oh, see, it's like doing it separately.
Oh, that's weird. Try doing it, just select all of them at once now.
Just all of them?
Mm-hmm. Everything, good. And just do Command-O.
It's like defaulting to, oh, never mind.
This is actually trying to open up in Capture One. Yeah. So we need to reset your file. So I'm going to show everybody how to do that. So really quickly, the problem that Bree is having right now is that she's double clicking on these raw files and it's trying to open up in Capture One. So if that happens to you, this is true of any file, any type of file. Select the first file, any file that's a CR2 file. So this first file, it doesn't matter. You could select a file on a hard drive that's a CR2 file. It doesn't make a bit of difference. Hit Command-I to actually bring up the Get Info dialog box. And down at the very bottom, there will be a thing that says Open With and a drop-down menu. Anything that can open that file will be listed in this menu, and you can actually add other things to it if you know that something could open it and it's not in this list. But you need to change, Bree, you need to change yours from, because yours is going to say Capture One in one of those files. You need to change it so that it says Adobe Photoshop. In my case, it's the version 2023. And if you were to just say OK right now, what would happen is that CR2 file will open in Adobe Photoshop, but nobody else will. You need to then click on this Change All button right here, and this will change the behavior for every CR2 file that you have to open in Photoshop 2023. Does that make sense to everybody? But this is not just for image files. So for instance, if I go to a PDF right here, so this Recoloring Fabric PDF, Command-I to bring up the info dialog box. I have all of my stuff open in Adobe Acrobat, but most of you, or a lot of you, prefer to actually have your files open in Preview. Again, you would just click on this, come down to Preview instead, and then once you had Preview here, click on Change All, and all of your PDFs will open up in Preview when you double click on them, and instead of opening up in Adobe Acrobat. In my case, I'm going to change it back to Acrobat and close that up.
It doesn't work really well recently because it keeps open my file in Photoshop beta. Even I said
if you've already opened it once, it's going to change that. But again, if you've got the CR2 file, it's no longer the CR2 file. It's now the actual Photoshop. It's the TIFF file that you made or the one that you saved. It's not the raw file. So you would have to go in and change the behavior for either TIFF files or for whatever you saved it in.
Yeah, I see.
Okay. Let's take a look at it right afterwards then, because this part isn't going to matter too much. You could open these separately in 2 groups. It doesn't matter, as long as you get them all open in Photoshop at some point. You could open them one at a time. So anyway, I've got all of these that are open up in Photoshop. I need to find the version of the file that's actually the one that I'm looking for. It's this one right here. This is going to be my sort of like main guy. And what I know is I'm trying to get rid of all of the wrinkles in here. So typically, and I will do this all the time, this is something, again, if you're retouching professionally for somebody, you need to ask them for the entire photo shoot that they did, because what you're looking for is there another file in there that may not, it may be a horrible picture of her face, it may be an assistant standing in the shot, it may be just a test thing that we did. I mean, it can be a million things. You're just looking for the one that, though, gives you the bits and pieces that you can use to rebuild this suit, or at least do 80% of the work. So if I take a look at this file number 63, my frame number 63, the lower half of it is actually pretty good. The problem that I've got is, if you look at the file that I'm trying to fix, you can actually see her crotch all the way up to her shoulder. If I take a look at this file, I'm missing a good part of her crotch. I don't see it there, so that's not the best for me to try to fix all the wrinkles that are here. But this is a good one for the top half of her. So it's pretty good from sort of like the bottom part of her boobs up. So I'm going to park this one for a second. I'm not going to get rid of it. I'm actually going to take a look at another frame now. And again, in this other frame, it's also good sort of on the top part, but again, it doesn't give me the crotch area that I'm looking for, but I'm not going to close it up. I'm going to save it for a second as well. I'm going to take a look at the next one and the next file. The only other ones that I've actually got open are frame number 53. In frame number 53, it's not really good on the top half, but the bottom half is actually really good on this. So I'm going to copy this suit from the bottom half part of her. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. I'm going to grab the quick selection tool and make it a little bit larger. And I'm simply going to try to get it to grab just the suit. And I'm going to go all the way down. If it selects more, that's not a problem. If it selects too little, that is a problem. I don't need to really go up on her shoulder a whole lot more than where I am right now, because it's not really helping me out. That's actually got a ton of wrinkles in it, so I'm going to have to attack that some other way. But I just need to make sure that it's gotten the entire edge of the suit. If you went actually beyond it, like I'm missing a little bit down here at the very bottom of her crotch, so I'm going to make that smaller and hit that part. I just want to make sure, like this, take a look at my screen right here. You can see I don't have the outer edge of the suit. It actually stops at this edge right here. So I'm going to go ahead and add the outer edge to the suit. Try doing that while you're not looking at it. And if I get a little bit of shadow in there, I'm not too worried about that, because I'm going to mask all of this out anyway. And I'm going to do the same thing along here to get this other line. Again, if you pick up part of the skin, don't worry about it. You can always, in this case, because I am going to mask, you're better off having too much than too little. And I'm going to go ahead and just continue it like that. So anyway, I don't really need this much of her skin, though, so I'm going to get rid of part of that. And then I'm just going to jump this to its own layer, Command-J. And if we take a look at what I've got, you can actually see it is the entire suit. I'm missing part up on the top, so I would go back in and fix all of that part. But basically, it gives me the suit, and this is a good place for me to start. So I'm going to drag this suit on top of the final image that I want to keep. So I'm just grabbing the layer, I'm dragging it over to the suit that I know I want to work on, holding down the Shift key and let go, and it will bring it in centered in my image. So this is the beginning of where I want to actually work with. However, this suit is not going to perfectly match the suit that's underneath it. So I need to transform it so that it does fit and cover the suit that I'm trying to fix all the wrinkles on. However, this is all destructive moves. By the way, I am going to do a little maintenance. I'm going to get rid of that frame number 53. I've gotten everything that I need to get out of it, so I'm going to close it up. It's just housekeeping so that it's not a memory overload. It's not trying to keep that image into memory and keep its changes and its history. It's not doing all of that stuff. I'm freeing up stuff here. Anyway, so the first thing I'm going to do is change this into a smart object. So up to the layer menu, down to smart objects, and convert this to smart object. That way that all of the transforming that I do on it is non-destructive. I can undo the transforming. It's a great thing, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to drop the opacity of this down to, I don't know, 75% so that I can see my new swimsuit and the old one behind it. I'm going to hit the V key to get the move tool, and I'm going to roughly put it into place. And then at this stage of the game, I'm going to puppet warp it. So up to the image menu, down to, the edit menu, down to puppet warp. It'll take me into puppet warp. If we click on show mesh, you can actually see the mesh that's around it. Again, I told you guys this before. If you have the horsepower in your computer to do it, you want to actually change the density of your mesh from normal down to more points. It just gives you more control. I don't need to keep seeing the mesh. I can actually uncheck the show mesh, but this will actually give me what I ultimately need to have in here. I'm going to then zoom in on this, and I'm actually going to start where the part of the suit would actually be attached to the ring that's on the bottom. So I'm going to click to put a point on that, and then I'm not going to click any other point. I'm just going to move this entire image, and I'm going to try to line up that little edge right there with where I think it should be so that this little point right here is old suit and new suit. Then I'm going to actually go right next to it across, because again, this is not a perfect fit right here. If I click on the opposite side of the part that's actually going around that ring, I can actually move this around so that I can spot it, and I realize it needs to be brought out and made a little bit wider. So that's now actually, these 2 points are set to cover the suit. Then I'm going to start to work on the middle part of her suit as it starts to go down to her crotch, and I'm just going to click and bring these points around so that this whole thing actually fits. Now, where it actually goes down between her legs, I actually need the suit to overlap the skin slightly. So I'm going to drag this point out so that it overlaps the skin just a little bit more. I've got to drag the suit out to make it longer. Then I'm just going to work my way up on the other side. If you need to come back and add points, you certainly can. You can even do this after we accept it the first time. Now, the patch that I've brought in has actually got the seam in it. I don't want to use the seam. If you look at the seam of the original suit, it's perfect. There are no wrinkles in it. So I'm going to use, all I'm looking for is fabric here in the middle to actually fill in those seams. So I'm just going to select this part, and I'm going to start dragging this out so that I hopefully go past the seam slightly with the one that I've actually got. And I'm just going to continue to work my way around. I'm going to go up to the suit handles at the very top and reconnect those. And you can sort of see just basically what's happening here in terms of doing all of this. And then I'm just going to work my way up the other side. So I'm not going to spend a great deal of time doing this, guys. You get the whole point that we're actually going for here. I'm going to zip back out. Remember, every time we move one part, so I've been working on the far side here, it is going to have an impact on the near side. So I need to click and drag the near side points so that they're covering as well. If you get pulls in the suit, like look at my screen right here, you can see where I've got this sort of arch that's happening in here. That can impact the way the fabric in the suit actually looks. I'll be tempted to come in and add another point here so it's more of a straight line and not that arc. That's why you want to make sure you're using more points in that. So anyway, I'm just going to work my way all the way around to do this. But in this case, I'm going to stop at this stage of the game and accept the transform. And then once I get this done, I can drag the opacity all the way back up to 100%. And you can see it looks pretty janky on here right now. That's fine. I'm going to put a layer mask on the suit. I'm going to put a black layer mask on the suit. So I'm going to hold down the Option key and click on Add Layer Mask. So now I'm looking at the original suit, but I've got a brand new suit that's sitting on top of this. I'm going to hit the B key to get a brush. I'm going to actually go to my tablet. You can do this with a mouse, but eventually we're going to work with tablet today. So it's typically how I would work on all of this. Hit the B key to get a brush. Check your brush to make sure that it's a relatively hard brush. I want pretty good control right on the edge where I'm revealing the stitching along the seam, because again, I want to keep that part. I'm going to go somewhere around 85% somewhere. That's a relatively hard brush. Make sure that your blending mode is normal, 100% opacity, 100% flow. I'm working on my layer mask. I'm going to hit the D key to default my colors to black and white. If white was your background color, you would hit the X key to make it your foreground color. And my brush, it's a giant brush, so I'm going to use my bracket keys to make it smaller. Perfect. And then I'm simply going to start painting in the new suit. So I'm going to work along this edge right here, and you can see on the edge that I've got right there, the suit is not matching, the seam is not matching. That's okay, I'll fix that part in just a second. But I'm going to work my way along here, and then again, I'm going to stay right along the edge of her skin. Now, it's really hard for me to paint along the edge of her skin, so I would go to the P key to get the pen tool and actually do a pen selection of the original suit. And I'll go ahead and complete this part. Go back to my path selection, Command click to load that as a selection, back onto my layers palette on the layer mask. Again, I want this to now show. So on my layer mask, I need to fill this with white. White is my foreground color. Option delete fills it, Command D to deselect. And then I can continue to work with my brush along the very edge. And you can see it gets rid of all the wrinkles. Again, we're just replacing the old suit with the new one, but I'm keeping the original stitching line of the original suit. And that's how I actually, again, I've got that really hard line. That's how I blend the old one in with the new one. I'm going to get rid of the wrinkles right here in the middle. And those right here. So you can see how we're sort of off to the races. This little area right down here that I had a problem with because I actually hadn't matched the entire suit first. You can do it after the fact. So I'm going to I'm going to break the chain link between the two, because when I puppet warp the pixel content, I don't want to puppet warp the mask. And if you leave these two connected, you puppet warp them both. I only want to puppet warp the image. The mask part I want to leave just as it is right now. So again, I'm going to double click on this puppet warp down at the bottom, because this is where all of my points are. And then I'm simply going to continue to add points with my puppet warp to actually pull it down to cover that area. And so now that's going to actually work for me, and then just accept my puppet warp. So this is basically the way I would start doing this. And you can see that the difference in the two, it's massive, and it's so much faster than going in and trying to use clone stamp tool, healing brush tool, frequency separation, all of those tools. You don't want to get to that yet. You want to do this heavy lifting, something like this. So the problem with this image right here, if we take a look at it, I'm going to hold down the Shift key and click on the mask so it's hidden, is that the upper part doesn't really, it's sort of okay. I've got a lot of lines that are right underneath her boobs. That part I've got to deal with somehow. The stuff that's actually on the top is okay. It's maybe not the best one that I've got. So I would look for another image that had all the wrinkles that are just underneath her boobs removed. And I've got one of them. So if we take a look at the other images that are actually open, this one right here, this frame number 63, is a little bit better in that area right there. I'm going to take a look at the other one that I have, frame number 66. Frame number 66 is even smoother in there. So I would just do the same process again. I would just simply grab the suit from this, turn it into a smart object, bring it on top of this, the image that I'm trying to keep, use a layer mask to, well, first off, use Puppet Warp to fit it, and then use a layer mask to control just the areas that I need to fix. Then once you get to that stage of the game, you're going to have a couple of images that you're going to need to marry together and smooth out. That's when you go to frequency separation and or tonal retouching to bring the two together. So I'm going to show you a quick couple of examples. There were a few standouts here. I'm not going to show you everyone's. However, Evan's was actually really done. Sophie's was really strong. True's was really good. Olivia's was really good. Gemma's was really good. I'm going to show you Olivia's really quickly. I think it was in many ways possibly the best of the bunch. However, there's a problem with this. And it's this. So this warning has actually come up, and it's saying, okay, this document does not have an embedded RGB profile, and that is problematic because the files so our working method, this should actually have something in here. So if you get this warning, I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that because it simply doesn't have one. But in doing all of this work, again, if you look at your edit menu down at your color settings, again, this needs to be set at North American pre-press, not North American general purpose, but North American pre-press to make sure that Adobe RGB is your working space on this. So at any rate, a couple of people are having issues with that. This is also a 16-bit file. Again, it's the way you guys are bringing your files in. My guess is, Olivia, are you coming in from Lightroom when you do this? Do you start in Lightroom?
No, I'm working on a different computer, so
Okay.
yeah, I just skipped over the settings.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's something, there's an issue in there somewhere. And the problem is that once you start doing all this work in sRGB, you can change it to Adobe RGB, but you don't get the benefit of having Adobe RGB the size of its space. It's still, sRGB is a little space. It brings that little space into a bigger one, but it doesn't make it any bigger. It's still little inside the bigger space. So just an FYI. But the work was exceptional. So if we take a look at this, I will show you how hers really quick. Again, the only issue that I had with this one is that it's missing texture again, but that all would have gone back to the initial redeveloping of the file to begin with. So if we had everybody else and take a look at this file, so what you can see in her case is she does exactly, actually I take that back. This one is actually done all frequency separation, so which is pretty impressive. So again, this is all frequency separation to actually do that. So that's what she's done here. So that part's great. Let me find somebody who actually did a more complete version of this though. So take a look at Gemma's really quickly. Yeah, so Gemma's, she did hers pretty much the way I just described it to you guys. So it starts out with the image right here. Then she actually does a Puppet Warp version for the top. So you can see the shift right there. She does another one for the sort of the mid area right there. Then she actually goes to the bottom area right here. And you can clearly see, you can spot the shifts that are happening from those three different areas. That's okay. Then she does here, she calls this Pixel Retouch. My guess is she did a merge stamp version of this and then did a little probably healing brush in there. Fair to say? Good guess. But to gild the lily, then she goes into frequency separation, which is really a smart move right here. And then finally she liquefies the image. And I think what she's liquefying is, it's this little weird part that's up here at the top. And I never thought about doing it that way, but it's really brilliant to do it that way. Because you run into this shit all the time. It's like, oh, I need that. But then when you do it, it separates it from the background, and you're just pushing it in with the background. Really clever. Smart move. Again, the only thing that I still had about this is that you can still see a little sort of blotchy tonal variation that's running across this. You might throw a tonal retouching layer on the very top of this just to smooth that part out, and you're golden. Are there questions about any of this part? Are we good? Again, guys, I can't tell you enough. Somebody says, Oh, I need more of a smile. You need to find the shooting and see if there's a smile in the shooting, because trying to actually retouch a smile into somebody's face is a nightmare. I'm sorry, what? Yeah, again, what it'll do is if you're doing just the least bit possible, you can pull it off. But if you do the real smile thing, whatever, people look like the Joker. I mean, it's just like, it's creepy. All right. Questions about this? Anyone? All right, we can close this up. We do not need to save that. Did you know Photoshop has a close all menu item? And it says it'll allow you to apply this to all of your images to not save them all. Anyway, we ended last week with a file, and I want to go back to that and make sure that everybody's got this file. And if not, I will give you my version of it. So it's this Jared file right here. Does everybody have this part where we got the correct girl into it but nothing else? Does anybody not have this? Okay, so where we got with this was we had scaled the girl correctly in size based on the height of the windows. And again, I was thinking about this the other day. If we actually move into this area again, again, I had everybody stand up and close your eyes and say, close your eyes, okay, where's the windowsill, right? And everybody sort of like closed their eyes. And some people, but if you think about it, when you approach a window and you need to open it up, you never start up here, do you? No. It's usually always, it's either kind of like at your eye level, or usually you have to bend down a little bit to get under the window to push it up, right? So that gives me some rough idea where the window needs to be, and it's pretty much right kind of below my chin. It's sort of in this area. So that's how we scaled the girl. She's actually, looking at her right now, slightly big. So I am going to, yes?
Mine just came up as when we first started with the first girl. Mine said come up.
Oh, then get rid of the first girl and bring this girl in. Because you've got this girl in your session 10 assignment folder. That's where the original girls both are. So for me, I am going to actually scooch her over just a little bit again. So I'm going to bring her over so she's right next to the window. And actually, she's scaled just about right for the window, because this is roughly where I said it would actually be. It's a little bit below her chin. So again, in an image like this, once you get them scaled correctly in the space, if you hold down the Shift key, hit the V key to get the Move tool, hold down the Shift key, you can actually take them right and left. And in this case, they will stay scaled and in perspective correctly, because you're not making them any closer or further away from the camera. You're just taking them left to right. So their distance from the camera is unchanged, so their scale would be unchanged as well. So I'm just going to leave her more out here kind of in the middle, because I like the framing of the light behind her a little bit. She separates a little bit more. So that's kind of where I'm going to go with this. Then if you haven't run, I've got my check layers already on here, but I'm going to throw them all away. So I'm going to select all of the check layers and just hit delete. So now basically just got two images right here. I've got the environment that we actually color corrected. Again, it's a smart object. It was a raw file. If it wasn't, I'll show you how we deal with stuff that's not a raw file to sort of get the same thing. But I color balanced the background. I actually ran auto on the background to actually get my the maximum amount of contrast and detail that I could get out of it. Photoshop wanted this to be actually darker. I didn't like that, so I kept that lighter. So anyway, I'm ready to put these two things together. So once I get this, I am going to run my check layers action. And once it goes through doing the check layers, you get this really solarized version. It's just the way that I built the action. It's because the color part of the check layers is on right now. I'm going to turn that part off. And I start with luminosity. And this is typically the way I do it, the order that I do this in. I start with luminosity always, then I'll go to color, and then finally to saturation. But once you hit saturation, then you need to revisit, you need to go back and revisit your luminosity check layer, because changing the color and the saturation of stuff can actually give the appearance that other things have changed as well, specifically the luminosity. So anyway, I'm going to turn on the luminosity check layer, and we can basically see sort of like what's going on with the girl. So I'm taking a look at her in this scene. Right off the bat, I know that she's too contrasty for this scene, because if you think about it, there's a very general light that's in this area. There's no way I would have as deep as shadows in her, in the coat as I've actually got in here. The shadows need to be lifted, but what I'm looking at right now is her face, and I'm saying to myself, okay, does her face fit in this scenario? Does it seem to work in this scenario? And when I look at this, I feel like her body is a little bit dark for the scene that this would actually be in. So my first move is to actually lighten her up before I do anything else. So this is a smart object already. There's two ways that we can actually lighten this whole scene up. The first is we're going to add a curve on the top of this. So I'm going to select the smart object that is just the body, and I'm going to add a curve on top of this, because again, I just want to change tone. So I'm going to click on the adjustment layer. I'm going to come up to curves. When I get curves on here, again, this is a very smart move to do this now. Even though it'll work if you hold off later, doing this now is just a good habit to get into. Your first move right off the bat is to change the blending mode of this curve, because you only want to change the luminosity, which is the tonal range. We don't want to impact the color. And the problem is that in RGB, when you change tone, you change color. So to keep that from happening, I'm going to click on the drop-down menu for the blending mode and change it from normal all the way down to luminosity. And then finally, I'm going to clip this layer to the figure. I'm hovering over the intersection between the adjustment layer and my image layer, holding down the Option key, and you'll get a cursor change that it turns into a square with a little arrow going down. That indicates that it will clip it, and it'll actually, this is now, will only impact the figure and not my entire image. You can also, this doesn't happen on all of your layers that you would want to clip, but at least on all the adjustment layers, you've got that very same little icon at the bottom of the properties panel. You'll see it's that square with the arrow going counterclockwise. If you click on that, it will actually unclick. Click on that again, it will clip it back on. Now, most people, I've said this before, most people, if they felt like they wanted to lighten up this image, would sit here, they would actually grab this curve in the middle and push it up. And it does lighten everything, but the problem that I have with this is that, number one, it changes the contrast in both places. You're actually making this curve steeper in the shadow part, but you're also flattening it out in the highlight part. In both of these cases, this is actually changing the contrast. We're flattening this curve down. An extreme example of a flat curve would be this. This is what a flat curve actually does. It completely flattens the image out. So you need to worry about that part. So instead of actually grabbing the curve in the middle, which is how most people have been taught, I'm actually going after the highlight part. So I'm going to grab the highlight up at the very top. I'm going to click that and drag it slightly to the left just to open her up a little bit more. So you can see the difference in what I'm doing now. I'm just turning the curve on and off, but it's lifting it, and she seems more in place to me. Now, that may not hold true later on because we've got other changes that we've got to make in here, but this is how I would go about doing it. The problem that I have with this, though, is that this is not impacting the shadow. This is not a true exposure adjustment. If you were doing an exposure adjustment in your camera and you were to actually open up, you would actually increase your shutter speed a little bit, or open up your aperture a little bit. To do that, it would have the same effect over the entire image. This is not. If you take a look at the shift that's actually happening up here in the highlights, that's much greater. There's actually no shift that's happening down in the shadow area here at all. If you wanted it to be equal along the lines like a true exposure would be, you would actually grab the black point down at the bottom of the curve and you would raise this up so that the curve actually maintained its 45-degree slash across this. However, if I look at that, I say, well, that just makes all of this image look horribly flat. I mean, this is just no way to go about doing this. So it works really well in certain things. If you simply need to lift the highlights a little bit, but you're not doing wholesale work on here, this will actually work. However, for me, I think a better way of changing exposure in this is not clipping a curve to this like this, but it's actually using Camera Raw. So I'm going to throw this curve away for the time being. I'm going to double click on this image, which will actually open it up. Inside of this is a copy of the raw file. So I'm going to double click on that raw file to open it up into Camera Raw, and I'm going to add a half a stop of exposure to this. So I'm just lifting this by 1/2 a stop. Now, the problem in doing this is I can't see this happen in real time with my background. So I'm just guessing at this. I'm going to say, okay, 1/2 a stop. And then when I go ahead and close all of this up, if it looks right, I'm fine. If it looks too hot, I've got to go back in and lessen this change. If it looks not hot enough, I've got to actually go back in and change this again. But I'm going to go ahead and say okay to this. It'll actually change the smart object, and then I'm going to close up the figure. It's going to say, do you want to save that? And I'm going to say, yes, I do. And so this is now my image opened up. However, I would like to see a before and after. The advantage of actually having this happen in history is that I can just do a Command Z back and forth, and I can see that this has opened it up. And for me, this is ideal. This is actually better off than doing the method that I actually did using the curve. This is also non-destructive because it's being done on a smart object. So this part actually works for me pretty well. However, it's setting her face the way I believe that should be, but it's still, I've got way too deep of shadows that are sitting here in her body. To open those up, again, we've talked about this, the best way to lift shadows is, again, another filter that unfortunately is not in the filter drop-down menu. It's actually in the image menu. So come up to the image menu, down to adjustments, down to shadows and highlights. So take a look at where I am. I don't know why they don't move this where it belongs, but they don't. Anyway, so adjustments, down to shadows and highlights. This is a smart filter. This will become a smart filter. By default, it only opens up the shadows. You can see that there's no, the highlights have been left at 0. The amount is left at 0, so there's nothing happening to the highlights here. It is just the shadows, but they're opened up way too much. Again, when I'm looking at this image, there's nothing believable about that. So I'm going to grab the amount slider of my shadow being opened up, and I'm going to kick it back down. Even though I'm sacrificing what's going on down in her lower body, sort of right in the, between her waist and her boobs, that's where it's the darkest for me. I'm not going to go after that part. I'm really just going after all the other shadow parts that are on here. Use your preview check mark to bring it on and off. And you can see it's actually lifted most of her body in a good way. I feel like in some ways it's a little too heavy on the lower part of her body. So I'm going to kick it down even a little bit more. Preview on and off. So I'm feeling better about where it is. So I've got an 8% lift on those. So I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that. However, I am still worried about this area right here. The area that's inside, sort of right underneath her chest part, that would definitely be lighter than it is. So I need to continue to open this up. To do that, you can't really use any of our filters. If you take a look, though, you'll see that we've actually got our smart filter is actually on here. However, the original change in exposure happens in the nested version of this smart object. So again, if I had to change the exposure like on her face, you would have to double-click on the smart object and then double-click on the nested smart object to get to this and drop this down and say, okay, I thought that was a little too hot. I'm going to change this down to like 4/10 of an exposure increase instead of a half a stop. I'm going to close this up and save it again. All of this is non-destructive. But now I need to open up the part that's just right in the center of her chest. So to do that, I'm going to add a curve on top of this. So make sure that you've got the smart object is selected. We're going to click on an adjustment layer. I am going to add a curve onto this. Now in this case, I am not going to use a blending mode of luminosity because I want to cheat. I want to make this whole thing lighter. And for me, the easiest way to do that, the fastest way of doing that, is to change the blending mode of this curve from normal to screen. It's a huge lift on this. Now, again, that's affecting my entire image. I only want it to be on that part of her coat. So first off, I'm going to clip it. So I'm going to hold down the Option key and I'm going to click this down to clip it. And I'm taking a look at this now, and guys, I'm not sure that I like screen on this. It looks like a lot of noise in here, and it's not really lifting the area I want to lift. So I'm going to change this back to normal and see if we can't just lift this area itself. I'm going to use the targeting adjustment tool. So it's the little hand that's on the properties panel that's got the arrow that goes up and down. I'm actually going to click on this area, and you can see it's actually right down here. It's almost at the black point. So I'm going to click on the black point and I'm just going to drag that up. And this seems like a better move to open that up. It's not as noisy. It just seems like a better move to me. So I'm not going to use screen to actually open this up. I am going to do this using my curve. However, I'm going to change the blending mode of this from normal down to luminosity. So at least I'm only impacting the shadows that are actually in there. Then I'm going to invert my mask. So Command I will actually make it black. Then I am going to go to my tablet. I'm going to hit the B key to get a brush. I'm going to make this medium hard brush. So again, I want a little control in here. It can spill out a little into these other areas, but that'll actually work well enough for me. Normal blending mode for my brush, 100% opacity. I'm going to take my flow all the way down. I'm going to scrub this in slowly. So I'm going to come down to around a 4%, 5%, something of that, in that nature for my brush. I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller. White is my foreground color. I am working on my layer mask on this, and I'm just going to start scrubbing in here, and you can see it begins to open it all up. I'm going to go after some of the other shadow areas as well, up around her neck. I'm just lifting all of this stuff in here, the part that's underneath her arm, to make this a little bit more believable, because again, she's in this room with a pretty flat light hitting her from all around. I'm going to go after her crotch area as well, around the gloves, this whole sleeve that's underneath. That sleeve that's underneath, I took that too far. So hit the X key to make black your foreground color, and you can take some of that part away. But this is now what I've got going on my mask, and you can see it's just lifted those shadow areas pretty well. I'm going to double click on the hand to kick all the way back out. Overall, this seems to me to fit the space more. Again, she doesn't have any shadows grounding her in here. I think that's a problem. I'm going to turn off my luminosity check and say, okay, how do I feel about this image in this space right now? So I am missing the shadows. I think that that's throwing me a little bit here. And I also feel like that there's more light that's in the if you look at the light that's in the top of it, there's windows that are surrounding the whole area, sort of like from her mid of her thighs part up. I feel like her shoes are too light. So I feel like her shoes and part of her legs need to be a little bit darker. But remember what's going on here in my shadow and highlight part. If we turn the shadows off, you can see that the whole background of her legs, everything gets darker here. I'm going to leave her shadows on. However, I am going to remove that part from her legs down. So you can see you do have a mask that controls your smart filters. So if I invert this smart filter mask by hitting Command I, you can see everything gets darker. I'm not going to actually do that. I'm going to paint on this image to actually make it a little bit darker. So make sure that the smart filter mask is selected, not the layer mask on the curve, but the smart filter layer mask. It's got the brackets around it. The B key to get a brush, and I can work with the same brush that I was using before. Again, normal blending mode, 4% for my flow, about a medium hardness brush on this. Black is now my foreground color. So as I start to work in the areas that are down on the lower part, it's actually going to hide that lifting of the shadows, and that feels a little bit better to me. I'm going to hit a little bit on her thighs as well, and I'm going to leave it at there. If you hold down your Shift key and click on the layer mask, you can actually, take that back, hold down the Option key and click on your layer mask forward. You can see this is what I've done. So the areas that are dark in here are not having the shadows lifted. Everything else is having the shadows lifted. So back to my image right now. I am going to do 2 quick shadows on her just to give us a little bit more believability. To do that, select your background layer. So again, it's the very bottom layer, because remember, you want your shadows on top of the background but underneath the figure. So I'm going to add a blank layer on top of that. I just want the shadows grounded in here before I do the color work and all of that, because I think this part is actually throwing me on the luminosity part. So that's the only reason I'm doing this right now. So I'm going to add a blank layer on top of that. I'm going to hit the G key to get the gradient tool. I'm going to go up to the top of my gradient menu, click on the drop down menu here, and in this drop down part I'm going to open up the basics, and I'm going to click on the one in the middle, which is foreground color to transparency. You can see my foreground color is white, so it's going from white to the checkerboard, which is transparency. That's actually what I want. So I'm going to close that up, and then in terms of the type of gradient, we're going to select the second one from the left, because it's the radial gradient tool, which is what I want. However, I need this to be black. Right now my foreground color is white. I need it to be black to do foreground, which would be black to build my shadow. I'm going to hit the D key to default my colors to black and white. It actually made black my foreground color. If it wasn't, I would hit the X key to go back and forth between till it was. So then I'm going to simply come in closer to her foot, click with my gradient tool to drag out a circular gradient that goes from black, my foreground color, to transparency. Hit Command T to bring up the transform dialog box. Hold down the Option key so that when I click and move any one of the side tools, it will move both of them in unison. So it's just a faster way to operate. You could have, I'm going to hit Command Z, you could click on one and drag it down and then click on the bottom one and drag it up. I mean, you can do all of those sorts of things. It's just, these are just faster ways to move. I'm also going to make it considerably narrower and drag it up a little bit. I'm going to rotate this to the side a little bit and bring it down to go underneath this 1 foot that's over here. Rotate it back a little bit. I'm actually going to drag it out a little bit because I need a stronger shadow underneath her toe. Holding down the Option key, I'm going to drag this out a little bit. That feels a little bit better to me in terms of where it is. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the check mark. Immediately hit the E key to go to your eraser tool. In my eraser tool, I've got it set up as the mode is a brush, 100% opacity with 6% flow. I don't think I've changed the flow on my eraser brush in 10 years. So at any rate, 6% works for me so that I can come in and actually do a scrub back on the a shadow that's going in front of her foot. So a lot of people are having issues with thinking about how shadows work. So if you take a look at me right now, not in that light, but if you take a look at me right now, if I've got a shadow that's on this side of my face, I've got a light that's on this side coming across. There is no way when you get to the shadows at my feet that there is going to be a shadow between me and the light. There will be a shadow on the other side of me, but there's never going to be one on the light side of me because that's where the light is. Make sense? Questions about that? Other people are also light that comes straight down. There would be, so if you take a look, the shadows that would be underneath my shoes are underneath my shoes, but that shadow would never spread out onto both sides of my shoes because those areas would be visible to the light source. The light source can see the sides of the ground that my feet are not covering. So people are actually doing, well, here, I'll show you what people are doing. So anyway, I'm going to leave that shadow as I would work on it considerably more, but again, this is more about doing our other work here, so for expedience sake, I'm not going to do that. I am going to add another blank layer on top of this to do another shadow for her other foot, and I'll show you what it is I was talking about. So again, G key to get the gradient tool, click and drag out, you get a gradient, Command T to actually transform this, hold down the Option key. I know I'm blowing through this kind of quickly, but again, once you start doing these shadows, I've done a million of these, so it just becomes the way that I think about doing this part. I'm going to bring this under her foot right here, and this is what I was talking about that people are doing. You can see shadow on both sides of her foot. That is an impossibility. The room is lighting the whole sides of her feet. The only light that is being removed is where her foot is actually casting the shadow right underneath her foot. So in this case, again, I like the solid part of the shadow that's right underneath her foot, but the sides on both sides would never be that way. So I'm going to go ahead and accept this, hit the E key to get the eraser tool, and you need to remove it entirely from the side of that foot and the other side of her foot as well. Those would never go out on those sides. The shadow is only cast directly underneath her toe where you can actually see it. I like this shadow enough to feel like I can probably use it to get away being the other foot shadow as well. So I'm just going to Command J this to duplicate it, hit the V key to move it, and I'm just going to bring it under this side over here. Perfect. Hit the E key to get the eraser tool and clean all of that up. So at least she's a little bit grounded in here. I think the shadows are way too deep, so I'm going to drop the opacity of the... Actually, I'm going to put them all into a group and then lower the group opacity in totality. So I've selected all three of my shadow layers. Click on the drop-down menu for the Layers palette. Say New Group from Layers, and we can call it Shadows. And then with them in the group, I can drop the opacity of the entire group. It's just a faster way of doing it. If you need to individually control the opacities, like the shadow that happens directly under her foot, or here, it's better to look at this shoe right here. The one that's directly under her foot is going to be stronger than the one that's directly under the heel, because the heel has been lifted up, which allows more light from the room to come in and lift that shadow. The stuff that's right underneath her toe, there's only like a ½ inch of space there for light to get in, so it's going to be darker in this area right here than it will be in this area back in here. But you guys get the rough idea of where I'm going with this. I'm going to double click on the hand to kick back out and sort of see where I'm going at here. I still feel like her lower body would be a little bit darker than this, so I'm going to go ahead and add that, and then we'll actually work on color. So I'm going to go back up to, this is the layer where I opened up the center part of her shirt. That part's great. I'm going to actually add another curve on this, right above the one that I've already got, because again, we need to clip all of these together so that they are all only impacting the figure. So I'm going to add another curve onto that. So in this curve that I'm actually adding to this, again, I'm going to clip it. I am going to change its blending mode from normal to luminosity. Then I'm going to, again, I just want this lower part to be darker, so I am going to grab a part right here in the middle and just make it a little bit darker. Again, I'm going to do what most of you have been taught to do. Grab from the point in the very center of this curve, bring it down to make it a little bit darker. It's made everything darker in here. I'm going to invert this layer mask, Command I, so that I don't see the impact of that curve. I'm going to then go to my pasteboard here, because the brush trick that I'm going to do right now, I need to be big, and sometimes you need the brush to be off of the image frame. So hit the F key to get to the pasteboard, then hit the B key to get to a brush, and I'm going to make this a really large brush, because what I want to do is I want to leverage the brush so that the edge of the brush so that it fades as it goes back or as it goes from the bottom to the top. So if you think about how this brush is going to work, the very center of the brush, if I were to actually hit this brush right down now on this layer mask, you would have to do it with white. The area that's right between her feet, if I put the center of the brush right where her feet are, the center of the brush is the most extreme, so it's going to be pure white there. As I start to move up towards the edge, the brush gets less and less and less and less, so it begins to fade. So what I'm looking for here is, I'm not going to do the center of the brush here, because this would make, if I did it here, it would make the most extreme part of this curve correction at her knees, and then as you move towards her waist, it would get less. As you move to her feet, it would get less. I don't want that to happen. I want the most extreme to be at the bottom of her feet, and as it goes up to her waist, it gets less and less and less. So I'm going to make sure that this is a completely soft brush. I'm going to change my flow back up to 100%. I'm going to make my brush larger so that the brush starts at her feet. The middle of the brush is at her feet, but then the top of the brush happens right about where her waist is. White is my foreground color. I'm working on the layer mask of this curve, and you want to do one dot. You don't want to move it around. You don't want to paint with it. You want to do one dot. So I'm simply going to click. In this case, it does not look like that put down a full. So if I take a look at the layer mask, that is by no means white. So it looks like my tablet is controlling the pressure of my brush. So I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. I'm going to go look at my brush really quickly in my drop-down menu. It says soft round here. It doesn't look like this, but I'm going to make sure that it is this soft round here that does not have any pressure attached to it. And then I'm going to come back here and click again on my layer mask, make my brush giant again. I'm going to click once. It gave me a flow of 6 again, so sorry, click once. And I have still got, this is being controlled by, thank you. The B key. Click on that, and that is what I'm actually looking for. So Command D to deselect. Command Z to undo that. Turn everybody else back on. I'm still working on that curve right here. So again, the center of my brush is at her feet. The edge of my brush is at her waist, which is how I want this thing to go. I'm going to click once to actually do that, and it gives me the same fucking thing. Sorry about that. But if we take a look at my layer mask, this is what it's done. That is not what I actually had it set up to do. Why is this not giving me what I want? So, we have not been to this place before, but we're going to go here right now to see what's wrong with my brush, because again, I keep going back to the original brush drop downs, to the legacy brushes that I had in the very beginning, and actually maybe that's the problem. I've got general brushes going here. Let me look at the legacy brushes on this. And yes. Yes, it is. That's exactly what it's supposed to look like. Mine doesn't look like that, does it? I need everybody to do me a favor. Go to your drop-down menu for your brushes. So just click on your drop-down menu. At the very top, with the current set of brushes that we've got right now, you should have a thing that says General Brushes, Dry Media, Wet Media. Can everybody find that? Anybody not find that? Okay, for me, I want to go back to my legacy brushes. These are the brushes that have been around in Photoshop forever. So if you scroll down, do you see legacy brushes right here? It'll be right under Special Effects. It'll be at the bottom. Do you guys have legacy brush? Okay, you can get them really easily. To get the legacy brushes, come up to the gear. The gear that's at the very top of that. Click on the gear, and you want to come down and you want to say legacy brushes right down at the very bottom. And it will actually add it to your thing. It's going to say restore this set to the list, and I'm going to say yes, restore it. And then if we click on our drop-down menu, you should have somewhere in there where it says legacy brushes. You can simply open that up. I'm going to also open up the default brushes, and I'm going to select the first one, which is a soft round brush. And then hopefully this is going to work. So I'm going to go back to my layer mask. I'm going to fill it with black. And then again, I'm going to make my brush larger. 100% opacity, 100% flow. Larger still. I'm going to click once. It did. What on earth is going on here? Nope, that finally worked. All right, so Command Z to undo that. I'm going to zoom in here. Again, the center of my brush is where it is. The edge is where it needs to be. I'm going to click to drop down that line. But again, if I take a look at this, that is not white on any level. All right, there's something very wrong with my Photoshop. I'm going to actually save this file. Go to my pasteboard. You guys don't need to do this with me. I'm going to quit Photoshop. I think part of this happens when I add the recording part. The recording video part of this has got a huge overhead for graphics. So let me quit Bridge though, that'll help. Quit Zoom. Quit Outlook. Quit Photos. Don't even know how that got started. I'm actually going to even quit Firefox. And let's see if that doesn't make things a little more predictable. Up to File, over to Recent, and we're going to open this file back up. I'm going to go ahead and fill again that layer mask with black. Hit the B key to get a brush. Click on that, and now it's working. So again, word to the wise, just when Photoshop is not working, quit it and restart. So this is actually now what's happened. I went through all of that to actually put a little bit of darkening down on her body, and that feels better, more correct to me. Again, I'm going to throw on my luminosity check layer to see how I feel about this. In some ways, I feel like she might still be a little too bright. I'm thinking about this room right now. So really quickly, I'm going to pull off that half stop that I added to this. So I just double clicked on the smart object. I'm going to double click on her again. I'm going to zero out that 4/10 that I actually opened it up. I'm going to say OK to that. I'm going to close it up and save it as we go along. This feels better to me. She feels more anchored in that space. So I'm liking this part. I'm going to turn off my luminosity check. This feels correct to me right now. So now I'm going to actually try my color check layer. Again, it's 2 layers. It's not just a single one, it's 2. You need to click on the group that says color control, color check layer right here, but you also need to make sure that the hue saturation and the color check layer both are turned on. In my case, only the hue saturation was on. And what it's designed to do, if you turn off the hue saturation, this is the true color of your image. These are the colors that are represented in our image. And you can see we've got very little that's in the figure. We've got a lot of stuff on the ground that's pretty much neutral color. It's just stuff that ends up, it's a neutral gray. It doesn't have any color in it. And that's why we see it the way we see it. However, it helps if we amplify that up. So what I'm doing with this hue saturation layer that I've added here in the check layer, it amps up the color. So even though we think that her jacket, that the coat is sort of a neutral gray, it's actually got a blue tint in it. However, I'm in a scene that is dominated by warm colors. Again, this is late afternoon sun streaming into this building, so I need to more emulate those. Again, this is not the effect, this is not what I'm looking for in here. I'm looking for them to be more homogeneous together. Again, it's wrong because if I've color balanced, if I've white balanced the background and I've white balanced the girl, which I have done, they are both neutral and they both should fit together, and they do. However, I'm cheating now to say that if I actually bring in some of the color, as if some of this warmer color in the room is reflecting into her, it actually makes it a more cohesive composite, which is what I'm going to do. So right or wrong, that's how we're going to go about doing it. So I'm going to go back down to the layers that I've been adding on here. So I'm going to my top adjustment layer. And you don't worry, all of your layers here will go through all the other ones. There's no layer order that you need to worry about with these adjustment layers. I could do this work underneath all of the ones that I've got on here. It's just easier for me to continue to build the stack going up. So I am going to add an adjustment layer on top of this. It's going to be color balance. The minute you hit color balance layer on the top, you need to change the blending mode from normal down to color, because that's all I want to change on here is the color. And again, I need to clip this down to the other ones that are already there. So you can either click on the little clip icon right here, or just hover between the color layer that we're doing right now and the curve layer that's underneath it that's darkening the lower half of her body. Hold down the Option key and click to clip this on. So what I can see right now, and this is exaggeration, is that her jacket is too blue. That's what this is all about. It's too blue. I need to actually warm that part up. So up here in the color balance layer, it is the blue yellow slider. You will notice in the color balance, these are complementary colors. If we go back to our original color color theory color wheel, again, the opposite of red is cyan, the opposite of green is magenta, the opposite of blue is yellow. So I'm simply going to grab the yellow, blue, yellow slider, and I'm going to start pushing it to more yellow. And it doesn't take a lot. Really quickly, you can see it jumps in and it starts to warm it up, but it's not giving me that orange. So it may not only be blue in there, it could actually be cyan in there as well. So then I'm going to grab my cyan slider and I'm going to push it towards the red. And you can see it's starting to get into the coloring that we've got going on here in the background. But I've also brought in some green into the final edges of this guy. So I'm going to grab the magenta green slider and kick it slightly to the magenta part. And you see the magenta takes off way too quick, like it owns this thing. So I'm not going to go with that magenta slider. I'm going to play around a little bit more with my yellow and my red to see if I can't get it to be a little bit more orange in there. And this feels like a better move to me. Again, I don't need it to be perfect. I just need it to be closer. If I then turn that check layer on and off, I can see what I've done. And I've clearly moved this into more of a warming range on this. So now I'm going to turn off of my color check layer for the color part. I'm going to turn that off. And then I'm going to take a look at this color layer that I just added. I'm going to turn it on and off. And you can see it's added sort of a warmer brown tone in here. So that part's actually working for me. I like the way this is actually looking. And then finally, I'm going to turn on my saturation check layer. And what happens in saturation is that saturation is now being mapped. Areas that are light in here have a lot of saturation. Areas in here that are dark do not have as much saturation. So when I'm looking at her face right now, she is actually swimming in a sea. Her face is swimming in a sea of desaturated color. Again, I've got a lot of desaturated that's down on the floor. I've got a lot of desaturated color that's outside of the windows. I'm not really thinking that there's a huge amount of light that's playing off of the frames of the windows, much less none of the stuff that's coming from the outside is actually hitting her face. So I'm feeling like her face is too saturated for this. It needs to match this area that's more in the front a little bit more. It's not going to be total. I'm not going to strip all of the saturation out of her face, but I am going to drop it down a little bit. So to do that, we're going to add another, again, I'm selected now my color balance adjustment layer that's sitting on top of these figures. I'm going to then add a hue saturation layer, adjustment layer on top of that. Again, I'm going to change the blending mode right off the bat from normal down to saturation, because I only want this to impact the saturation. I don't want it to shift color, and I don't want it to shift my luminosity. And then finally, I'm going to change saturation. I need to clip this so that it only impacts the figure. So hover between the color adjustment layer and the hue saturation layer, hold down the Option key and click so that it's clipped to the figure right now. And then I'm simply going to be more specific about this. If you were to drop the saturation master slider right here, if you could drop this down like this, you see it impacts her face, but why be that general about it? It's not only going to shift the saturation of her face, it's going to shift the saturation of her entire figure. I don't want to do that. It's only her face that I'm concerned about. So I'm going to Command Z to undo that. I'm going to use the targeting adjustment tool and hover right over her face and click. And you'll see when you do that, it actually changes your hue saturation slider to only be impacting this color range that's right in here, which is again in the sort of the reds and yellows, which is primarily her skin tone. Now when I shift the saturation slider down, it is more restricted to just her face, and you can see I actually have more control. I've gone down considerably more to even get even the smallest shift in her skin tone. So that's where I'm going to go with this. I'm going to turn off the saturation check layer, and then I'm going to come back down to my hue saturation adjustment layer. I'm going to turn it on and off and say, does this feel more correct to me? Now when I look at this, it's matching the background parts pretty well, but in a weird way I feel like it's a little bit too strong. I feel like I've cut that back too much. So I can either grab the saturation slider up at the top, and I'm seeing it says roughly 37. I'm going to just round that up to 40 and say if I wanted to cut this in half, it would be 20. So I'm going to kick it back to 20, somewhere in there, and say, does that feel better to me? And it does feel better to me. So this starts to be a more subjective kind of thing. But this girl now has been scaled and placed in everything that's in this image, and we're off to the races. Did this work for all of you? All right, we can close this up and start on our next one. I'm not going to save that guy in spite of all that work. So let me get to the same place that you guys, for what you ended up downloading. Hang on one second. So in our composites part 1, we're going to go to Alex's next. I'm just going to go in order here really quickly. So if we double click on Alex's, it opens up. Again, I'm going to double click the hand. So what can you guys tell me about this image? What can you tell me about the light source?
Super harsh.
It's harsh. It's direct sun, right? Yeah, not a cloud in the sky. Blue sky. Where's the sun? Where is the sun? Right side or left side? Look at the shadows. Look at the shadows. Forget the figure. As a matter of fact, you can turn the figure off. Look at the bears. Again, the shadow right here from this bear's head is casted right across its leg. That means the light has got to be coming from this side over here. And it's actually, look at the shadow of the other bear. It's actually kicking out on the ground right here. So I know that this is actually a direct, harsh side light. Is that the light that is on this figure? No, this figure is actually top lit. Again, it's pretty contrasting from the top. It is directional, but it is not this. So it is actually the other figure. This is the wrong figure for this image. That's why I give you both figures. So to fix this, we need to get rid of all of the image part that Alex has actually done in here. I'm going to go all the way up to the very top. I'm going to select the check layer group. I'm going to turn it on just so that I have it. And then I'm going to go all the way down to the figure. I'm actually going to continue to go down and select the shadows that are underneath this. I'm going to hold down the Shift key and click on it, and then the Delete key to get rid of it. I'm going back to nothing but the bears. So I've just got the bears here. This is how I'm going to start with this whole thing. Is everybody good on? I realize I need to slow this process down. Everybody good? We gotten rid of everything except for the bears. We good on this part? Okay. I'm going to shift the bears. I'm going to change them because I don't really think that the bears thing is what I'm really looking for here. So I'm going to show you, this is just how I would approach it. I'm going to hit Command J to make a copy of that, and then I'm going to convert this to a smart object. And the reason I want to do this is that even though I do not have the raw data of the bear file, I'm sure Alex, I don't know, maybe this is your file, maybe it's something you just found online. It's yours? Okay, so if it was yours and I knew how to do it, I would get back to the raw data because I'd much rather process the raw data. But that's not always the case. Sometimes, again, a lot of you guys have found backgrounds that are actually online and they're in JPEG format. They're not the raw file at all. So we can actually still do this kind of work. I'm going to make this a smart object. So up to the layer menu, down to convert to smart objects, convert to smart object, or go to the filter menu and come down and say convert for smart filters. It does the exact same thing. It just turns this into a smart object. It's going to say, okay, do you want to do that? And I'm going to say, yes, I do want to do this part. Then I can use the camera raw filter. Again, if you double click on this, you're not going to get anything but a copy of the bear in a separate file. You don't get the raw data. That's gone to us. But if you come up to the filter menu and you come down to camera raw filter, this will emulate the way camera raw works. Now again, this is baked data. So this is not going to be anywhere near as good as if we were able to actually get to Alex's raw data. But I'm going to take it here because it does so many other things that I can't really, that I don't want to spend the time doing using layer masks and all that kind of stuff. So my first thing is to actually do a color balance on this. I feel like in some ways the color balance of this is close, but it's not perfect. For me, maybe the rocks have got this much red in it. I'm having a hard time believing that, but nonetheless, we'll find out. I am going to grab the targeting adjustment, the white balance eyedropper tool. And I'm looking in this scene for something that I think should be a neutral white. Can anybody in here find anything that they feel should be a neutral white? Yes? There is. This thing right in front, I think it's probably pigeon shit on this rock or something right here, but this might be. So I'm going to just see what it looks like. Again, every time I use my zoom tool, this is another bug that happens. I have to reselect the white balance eyedropper like 2 or 3 times, but I'm going to come here, I'm going to hit on this to see what happens, and you can see it actually puts a ton more red into here, so that one's not really going to work for me. However, there is something that's up on the very top ledge. I think it's a light. This is probably something for night. There's something up on that very top that I want to zoom in. I don't really know what it is, but I get the feeling that it's something, they are lights. It's something mechanical, human, so that might actually be white. So again, I'm going to select my color sampler, the white balance tool, and I'm going to click on that. That actually neutralizes the color a little bit more. To see the before and after, come down to the bottom of your the bottom of the image, sort of in this area right next to the basic panel. There's 2 things that are actually here. You can do either one of these. You can cycle in your before and after. So I'm cycling here in my before and after, and I'm looking at the 2 right now, and this is the one that I've actually got going right here, and you can see it's pumped in a whole lot more color here, so none of this is actually working for me. So if I want to reset everything that's in this, I can actually come up to the 3 dots. First off, I'm going to click to go back out of that. And to reset it, go to the little 3 dots that are on the far right-hand side at the lowest part underneath. It's the last thing in the upper part of the workspace. If you click on those little 3 dots, you can actually come back to reset to default, and it will restore everything. In this case, I'm going to accept the color balance because everything I've tried has only made this thing worse, so I'm not happy with that. However, while I am in here, I am going to check on see what Photoshop thinks this should be processed by. So I'm going to click on the auto button, and you can see there's a very long I've still got my before and afters on, so I'm going to turn that off. Again, I'm going to go back and forth between my auto buttons and all of this. So in my opinion, I think what it's doing for the exposure, it's saying it needs a 3rd more stop in exposure. I disagree with that. I don't think it needs the 3rd more stop exposure, but I like what it's done to my highlights and shadows and my whites and blacks. So I'm simply going to double click on the slider for exposure to 0 that back out. This is now my before and after. I'm actually going to just do the second of the icons that's down at the bottom that lets you go back and forth between the 2. And you can say to yourself, okay, do I like this one better or do I like this one better? Now, I know the image that I'm bringing in here tends to be a little bit on the hot side. Contrast is my enemy in that image. And so in this case, I'm going to go ahead and go with the auto version of this that's actually been zeroed out in exposure and simply say, okay. However, this is a smart filter, so if we felt like once we bring the figure in it's not working, we can always double click on this and change it and zero it back out again if that's how we're going to go. But at least I'm feeling like I'm in a good position to start from. Then I'm going to go find the other figure. So if we go to your session number 10 folders, I take it back, it's not in 10, it's in 9. So in your class session 9, student folder, assignment folder, here are the two figures. I'm going to grab the composite of the girl that's in yellow, and I'm going to double click on that to bring her in. I'm going to do a hide for others so that I can work with her. I'm going to grab her layer, drag it onto the bears, hold down the shift key and let go. It's going to say the target has got a different bit depth. Now I can see that Alex works in 16-bit. Not sure why. So at any rate, I'm going to say, no, do not proceed. I want to make things faster. So I'm going to change his bit depth to 8-bit instead of 16-bit. Again, it's this 16 right here that is showing me why things are taking so long in doing all of this work. Up to the image menu, down to mode, down to 8-bit. So again, image menu, mode, 8-bit. And now you can see that 16 is no longer a 16, it's now an 8. The file is now half the size that it was. If you click on your window menu up at the top, at the very bottom you will see all of the elements that you actually have open. So I'm going to go back to my composite body. It's right here. I'm going to click again on the smart object, drag it over onto the bears, hold down the shift key and let go, and it actually brings it into space. So then I need to figure out how to scale this thing. So in order to scale this thing, I need everybody to do this with me, please. Again, this is all about the memory of it all. I need you to go to your browser. So as much as I hate to do this, I'm going to launch Firefox. And I'm going to do a search, average height of a bear. Average height of a bear. Well, I know that's not a polar bear. I know it's not a giant panda bear. I'm going to look at right here. I'm going to say that that's probably a brown bear. I got no idea, but probably a brown bear. It's roughly between 2 feet and 5 feet tall. I'm going to just split the difference. So 2 feet to 5 feet is, if we split the difference in that, 7 is 3.5 feet tall. 3.5 feet tall is 40 inches. Does that make sense to you guys, roughly? Okay, so let's figure that part out. This gets a little tricky. There's a little math involved, but don't let this scare you. This is as math-centric as we'll get in here. So I know my target, and actually I'm going to write this down. I told you this before. I keep a pad of paper next to me to just not jot down notes all the time. So bear is 40 inches. Okay, back into our image right here. I'm going to turn the girl off right now because I don't need her right at this second. What I do need is a way to measure the bear and see how tall the bear actually is. So I'm going to start with guidelines. If you do not have your ruler showing, you cannot pull down guidelines or pull guidelines to the side. To get your rulers to show, come up to the view menu, come down to rulers, make sure that there's a check mark next to it, and you will see the rulers. If you control click on the ruler, you will get a drop down menu and it will say you can make these in any increments that you want. For this kind of work, you want to use pixels because we're going to be very precise about this. So go ahead and click again, control click, or unless you've got a right button mouse, it's just a right click as well. If you don't have either of those, you can actually do a 2-finger swipe on a trackpad will give you a right click. But anyway, you're just used to doing control click, select pixels. Then I'm going to click on this top ruler line and I'm going to drag down and I'm going to put a guideline right underneath the bears. I'm looking at the bear on the right side. I'm going to actually put a guideline right under his foot. and then I'm going to come back up and I'm going to pull another guideline down to the hump on the top of his back. So this will give me roughly the height of the bear. Everybody good on this part? Because I want to make sure you guys get this part. Okay, over in your tool panel, if you click on the eyedropper tool, click on the lower right-hand part, you will get a flyout menu. And in that flyout menu, you will have the eyedropper, the 3D material eyedropper tool, which is interesting since Photoshop has now abandoned 3D in Photoshop. Why you don't clean your shit up, Adobe, and get rid of that, I don't know. Anyway, continue down underneath the color sampler to the ruler tool. And if you pick the ruler tool, come over to your image. I'm going to go to the very top guideline. You'll get this X. That's what the ruler tool looks like. If you click on the top line and you start to drag down, you can see that you can move your ruler in any direction you want to. However, if you hold down this Shift key, it will restrict it to either going up or down or straight left or straight right, but it's a way to restrict it. You want to come down till you get to the bottom and let go. Then you will get a readout in your info palette, and you can see my readout has given me a height of 705 pixels. So you are not going to see, actually I'm going to do a new menu, a new window here. You guys don't need to do this. I'm doing this just so that we can, so you can see how the math works. Okay, so this is how the math works. I know how tall my bear is, and I know how many pixels tall the bear is as well. So this is the way you want to set up the math part, and then it gets really easy. So the bear itself should be 40 inches tall. So hang on one second. It's something a little bit bigger than that. Jesus. Yeah. Sure. What's happened? No, just say no. Don't even know why it's asking you that, but hit cancel.
Like I can't even add another thing.
Keep hitting cancel.
It just has that.
Yeah, but that's because you're working down on this part right here. What are you trying to do?
Just add the other ruler, but even on this layer, it still says the same thing.
It's trying to paint. You don't have the ruler tool. Go to the eyedropper tool. No, eyedropper. Eyedropper. That guy right there. And you don't have all of the tools that you need in here. So to get to the other tools in here, come to Edit menu. Down to, keep going down to toolbar. And then in the toolbar, all of these are orphaned. You don't have any of these. Oh. So if you click on Restore Defaults, you'll have them all, and just say Done. And then go back to the eyedropper tool and go to the ruler tool. And it should work on it. Okay, so this is how the math works. What we need to do is we need to get a scale so that we know how tall the girl should be in pixels. So to do this, we're going to start with the bear because that's what the things that we actually know. So I know the bear is going to be 40 inches tall, so just do a 40. What is going on here? Brush tool. Okay, so do a 40. I'm going to put a line underneath my 40, and then right over here next to it, I'm going to do the size in pixels, 705. Then I'm going to do a line under that. Then we need to do the girl. How tall is the girl? So I know for a fact how tall she really is, but you can guess if we actually turn her on. So she's typical model, let's just say 5'10". She's in heels. That gives her another 3 inches. So let's just call it 6 feet tall. It's going to be close enough. So How many inches do you have in 6 feet? 72. So you put that number underneath the other inches. So what I'm looking for, I've got inches to inches, and I need pixels to pixels. Does that make sense to everybody, what's going on? So then the way you figure out this value is you cross multiply. So what that means, what we're going to do here is you do 72 times, again, cross multiplying, times 705. And then you divide it by the other figure, by 40. And that will give you how many pixels belong right here. So if we go to the little calculator, and we do, let me hide everything else so that you can see it. 72 times 40 divided by 705. Say what? Oh, I'm sorry. You're right, and that's how it is. That's why I've come up with a completely wrong number. Okay, so 72, again, cross multiplying, times 705 divided by 40. So the girl should be 1,269 pixels tall. That's why we do this in pixels. It makes the math much, much easier. Does that make sense, everybody, what I just did? Are we good on this part? All right, so we can close this up. I'm going to park this because we're going to do another one later on. So now I'm going to go back to my ruler. Sorry. Back to my ruler tool. I'm now going to click on the bottom. I'm going to click and drag up, and what I'm looking for, again, I'm going to hold down my shift key. I'm looking for the readout over here in my info palette of the height. And I'm just looking to get to 1,269. So 1,269, and I'm going to let go. And then I'm going to drag another guideline down to the top of that. You'll see that your guides snap. That's how tall the girl needs to be in proportion and scaled based on the height of the bear. Are we good on that part? All right, so then let's turn the girl on. I'm going to hit Command-T to transform her right away. Click on the link between width and height, and I'm just going to make her shorter right off the bat. I'm going to then drop her down so that her feet are on the bottom line, so again, the bottom foot, so that I can get her scaled to this. I'm going to drag the anchor point from the middle part down to her feet so that this way, instead of her getting shorter from the top and the bottom towards the center, I'd simply go from the top down. And then I'm just going to grab the top and drag her down so that she is now as tall as those two guidelines, and hit the enter key. Then you can clear your guides. They've done all their work. Up to the view menu, down to guides, down to clear guides. She is now scaled in proportion to this. So again, I can move her right and left. So hit the V key. She can go to the right. She can go to the left. However, if I want her closer to the camera, let's say I want her up on this part up in here, I've got to scale her in proportion now. Now, I've told you guys already that I know from shooting this that I use the converging lines in the studio to determine where her horizon line is. Her horizon line is really in the middle of her stomach. It's right about where her belly button is. That's her horizon line. So if I do a Command-T on this to transform, it actually puts the anchor point slightly lower than it really should be. So I'm going to raise it up to where I know it should be. It's again pretty much right at her waistline right here. Then hold down the Shift key and the Option key and click and drag, and she will be scaled in proportion. She is now on the front of the rock, scaled in proportion to the bear that's further behind her. Are we good on that? with her up on this front rock. If you're happy with where she is roughly, you can go ahead and say okay to that. You can again still hit the B key and move her right and left, as long as you don't run into something that you can't explain. Like if she was right on that ledge of rock back there, I wouldn't be able to do that. But you can move her all the way over here to this other side over here. She is still scaled in proportion to all of this. So she's correct on the bear right now. So my next move is to go ahead and run my check layers. Again, I'm not going to bother with shadows right now, even though it helps with the illusion of it. But nonetheless, I'm going to run check layers. So back to my actions palette. Check layers, go ahead and run that. I'm going to turn off the color check layer and start with luminosity. So in the luminosity part, what I clearly know is problematic in this is the amount of shadow that she has on her shadows are way too dark. Imagine she's in this big, broad, open area in the zoo. There's all of this light that is hitting all of these rocks down here. There's light that's hitting all of these rocks that are around here. There's a lot of light coming in on this thing that would open up the shadows on the side of her face. Her face would never, ever, 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 ever be this dark. It's way too contrasty. So that's where I'm going to start. I also think I'm going to probably have to lift her a little bit in terms of how bright or dark she is, but I'm going to go after the shadows first because that's the most glaring part of it. So again, I'm going to select her. She is a smart object, so I can run shadows and highlights on her. So up to select the figure itself, the smart object, up to the image menu, down to adjustments, down to shadows and highlights. It's going to actually automatically put in that 35, and to be perfectly honest with you, I think that's a pretty good mix right there. I'm going to turn this on and off and say, yeah, that actually works for me, because I also think she's a little bit too dark for this scene, so I think when I actually open up that part of her, that she'll end up the shadows will be lifted even a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and say okay to this. Then I'm going to double click on the girl because again her exposure needs to be lifted. Again, I've got the raw data for her, so it actually, when I double clicked on the smart object, it opened up the image file that I used to create the knockout. I'm going to double click on the green screen version of it to get to my raw data. And I'm going to take this raw data. This is how I actually figured out where the horizon lines would be. You can see the edge of this foam core is right here. This gives me a converging line, and so does this one right here. So these simply drawn back is what established the horizon line and the vanishing point, roughly about somewhere around her belly button area. But at any rate, I'm going to actually bump this a half a stop and say okay. I'm going to close up the image now that I've done that and save it. And this now is looking a little bit too bright to me. That actually looks like so, but I have some sense about how bright it is. I'm going to guess it's about half of that. So I'm going to double click again on the figure, double click again on the image to get into my data, and I'm going to drag that down to about a quarter of a stop more exposure and say okay to that. Sometimes I'll get frustrated doing this because it's opening a lot of things and saving a lot of things and all of that. I might actually go after just the highlight part of this. But this actually seems better to me in terms of looking at it. I feel pretty good about this part right here. But like I say, this is getting frustrating for me. I want to be able to see this in real time to see if what I think I'm doing is really what I'm doing. So if that's the case, I'm going to go to my history, and I'm simply going to go back in history to my shadows and highlights. Now, nothing has happened to this girl, so I'm just going to use a curve to actually lighten her in here so I can watch it happen in real time. So with the girl selected, I'm going to add a curve. I'm going to change the blending mode of that curve to luminosity. I'm going to clip the curve to the girl. And then I'm just going to grab the highlight part and push it to the left a little bit to open her up a little bit more. And that seems like a better fix for me. She seems, again, if you sort of blur your eyes a little bit and sit back, does she stand out? Is she sort of matching in there? That feels about right to me. So then I'm going to turn off my luminosity check layer, and I'm going to turn on on and off this, and I feel like that actually did the brightening part pretty well. Again, if you want to do a quick version, if you turn off the shadows and highlights eyeball, it actually recalculates the entire smart object, which takes time. Instead, if you select the layer mask for the smart filter and just invert it, it'll go back and forth really quickly. And you can say, yep, that actually looks correct to me. I like how that feels. That seems correct. So my next move in this is to go after my color check layer. Make sure that both the hue saturation and the color check layer are on. So in looking at this, it seems like she fits this part pretty well in looking at this. I'm looking at the, the surround of this. It doesn't seem that off to me, especially her face seems correct to me. So I'm going to leave the color where it is right now. I may revisit it in a second, but I am going to check the saturation part. So I'm going to turn off color right now. I'm going to turn on my saturation check layer. And in looking at this, there's clearly more saturation in her than there is in the rest of the image. It's not radically different, but it's different enough. So at this stage of the game, you have two options. You can actually either decrease the saturation of the girl or you can increase the saturation of the background. And this happens a lot in contrast as well. In some cases, you can't really eliminate the contrast of the girl enough to make the match happen. So your solution is to do whatever you can to reduce the contrast of the girl, but then go into the background and boost the contrast of the background. So you're still pushing everybody to get to a meeting point. But so I'm going to drop the contrast on this. So I'm going to select that curve that is controlling the luminosity of this. I am going to add a hue saturation curve on top of that. I'm going to change its blending mode to saturation. I am going to clip it. Sorry. And then I'm going to use the targeting. Actually, I'm going to do the whole overall thing because it's not just, her face isn't really bad. It's the dress that's bad. So I'm going to take the dress and I'm going to just drop it back a little bit. So I've pulled mine off roughly a 15 or a 16. I'm going to turn off my saturation check layer, and then I'm going to go back into my saturation layer and turn it on and off. And for me, it feels like I've maybe pulled it off about, again, twice as much as it really needs to be pulled off. So I can either change the saturation from 16 to a -8, or I can drop the opacity of that from 100% to 50. I'm just going to drop this down to an 8. And again, turn it on and off. And this is where I would actually start. This is a much better blend for me. So to see the difference, come over to your history panel, click on the very bottom, the little camera, to make a snapshot out of it and say okay to that. And then we'll run up to the top and take a look at Alex's to begin with. Miniature 3-foot tall girl with where it really should be. Make sense?
Well, so mine is black. Like it's not showing. When I put when I put this.
Well, keep all of those off. You can only have one check layer on at a time. You've got your luminosity on as well. So only the saturation by itself. That's what it looks like. We can close this guy up. We've got one time to do one more. We're probably going to continue to work on these next week as well. Well, let me ask you this. Is this helping you guys work with this stuff at all? I mean, this really is check layers at its best, and if you can get this stuff down, it'll change your compositing forever. Yeah, it's true.
I was going to say, one thing I saw was that sometimes people will like run their luminosity check layer and like check the actual what do you call it, depth of the certain mid-tone and to see how much black is in it. Do you think that would help, or is that too touchy and you should just do how it works?
For me, it's all, again, the reaction that whether your comp works well or not is based on people just looking at it. They're not going to go in and look at the numbers and say, it gets to be really tricky. I mean, you can get really, you know me already. You can tell I'm a numbers guy, but that's really getting into the weeds. Yeah. All righty. Let's see what's next up. So next in the group is Amanda's. I'm going to skip Amanda's for a second. We'll come back to that. I want to see if there's something in here that we really haven't covered a lot already. Yeah, let me just take a look at everybody else really quickly. Let's start with Evans, because there's something else in here that we can look at. There's a couple of other things in here that I want to look at to show you guys, and I can pull it in using Evans. So if you go to composites part number 2, and there's a file in there that's Manly is the beginning name on it, and double click on that. It's a girl sort of in a path that's in the woods with, looks like a typical fall, fall cloudy day. So can everybody find this image? Okay, right off the bat, beginning, or the question here, lighting. Where's the lighting coming from in my background scene? It's kind of the whole big sky overhead, right? Which was really what I was trying to do when I was lighting the girl. Again, overhead. She's a little bit more contrasty top to bottom, but again, the lighting is not directional. If we tried to use the other girl in the yellow dress, it would never work in here. I want to get rid of the majority of the work that Evan's actually already gotten in here. So I'm going to click on, again, on the color check layers. I'm going to come down. I'm going to get rid of all the ones that he's used. I don't want to get rid of the girl. She is the correct girl, but I want to sort of start where he was starting from to do all of this. Although I will say in the beginning part here, there's a lot about this that is correct, but nonetheless, I want to go through all of the steps with you guys. Hold down the Shift key and click on. So I've got all of the actual correction layers as well as all the check layers. I'm going to get rid of everybody there. He's got shadows and highlights on here. I'm also going to get rid of that. So I'm just going to grab the whole smart filter group and throw that away. He's also got shadows on this. I'm going to leave those where they are, but I'm going to turn them off. And then I'm going to start where I always start on here, and that's with the background. So it looks like this is a smart object, and by the naming of it, I'm hoping it's got my raw data in it. So I'm going to double click on this to actually get to the raw data, and hallelujah, it actually is. So is there something in this image that I can use to color balance this image with? Anything in here that should be a neutral gray. So all of us would think, well, the sky is really, yeah, the sky is gray, but I don't know that that's really a neutral gray. At least I don't trust it. Jared, you were going to say something. The gravel, maybe. Top of the mailbox, maybe. Actually, I discourage doing it, but the mailbox itself, it's actually a dark black or a dark gray. It forces a Photoshop to actually work harder than it probably should have to work to do this, to actually do the color balance. But look what's been tacked onto this post. I'm actually going to zoom into this even more, like 400 millimeter right here. Don't you figure that whatever these little labels are on here is probably white? And doesn't that look like a white border around this poster? Looks like white to me. We'll see what the color shift is actually going to be. So I'm going to click on the color sampler tool. I'm not the color, the white balance tool. I'm going to try just the edge of the poster to click to see what happens. It's pumped a lot of red in here. I don't know that I trust that. I'm actually going to click on then part of the thing that's really on the poster to see if that shifts things. That's warming things up considerably. I'm going to try the mailbox itself. We're going to click on that. Clicking on the mailbox agrees with clicking on the little part in the center, the whatever that white shit is in the middle of the poster. Those two agree with each other. There is no shift to speak of. I'll take that back. There's a big shift. I'm going to go back to the mailbox. I'm going to zip back out. And I actually like what the mailbox part has done. Again, you've got a before and after here so you can sort of see the difference. And this is the difference between where Evan started and where we are right now. And you can see it sucked a lot of that blue that's really classical of overhead skies out. So I'm going to pull this part out and say okay to that. So now I've started with a neutral background. However, I'm going to go right back into Camera Raw by double clicking on it again to see what it thinks about the exposure of this. So I'm going to click on the auto exposure part, and it darkens everything up. And so for me, thinking about the girl that I'm putting in here already, I already know she's contrasty. She's pretty seriously contrasty. And you can see that this has actually pumped up the contrast considerably. It's pulled down my highlights to try to recover some of the sky. I'm okay with that. It's dropped my exposure slightly. Again, if I don't like what it did with my exposure, I can always double click on that to zero it out. And I actually might leave it that way, but it's done all of this highlight shadow work on here, which I think has made it a more contrasty image, which is only going to make it simpler for me to deal with a figure that's already more contrasty. Make sense to everyone? So this is how I'm going to go with this guy. And again, you can click on the beginning, or the sort of the beginning and end of all of this to see what we think. But right off the bat, you can see it's contrastier in all of this. So this is how I'm going to go with mine, my choice. All right, I'm going to go up to the top, turn the girl on. I'm going to then scale the girl to begin with. So to scale her, again, how tall is the mailbox? Well, you can say that, but the truth of it is, a mailbox is the height of a car window, because you have people who deliver the mail, open the window, and they set the box at the height so that somebody doesn't have to get out of the car. They can just shovel the mail into the car, right? So how tall? I'm sitting in what would be like a car. I would probably be a little bit higher because of the tires of the car. So I'm going to say about this level right here. Now, I don't know how tall this level is, but if I do it for my stomach part right here, I am 5'10". So this is, I'm going to say 4 feet. I can get more exact about it, but I'm going to say 4 feet. So again, I'm going to do our scaling trick. I'm going to grab one guideline for my ruler and pull it down to the bottom of the mailbox. I'm going to grab another line and pull it down to the top of the mailbox. I'm actually going to then go to my ruler. So again, the eyedropper tool down to the ruler tool. I'm going to click on the bottom one, hold down my shift key, go up to the top one, let go. So the mailbox, and you'll see this is now a negative value. It's because I've gone from the bottom up. If you go from the top down, it'll be a positive value, but you don't care about that. You just want to care about the number of pixels. So the mailbox is 747 pixels. It's also 48 inches tall. So if I go back to my math right here and go to the B key to get a brush. So I've got 48 inches for the height of the box is 747 pixels. The girl, we've already talked about how tall she is. I'm going to do still the same 6 feet for her, 72 inches. So again, I'm going to cross multiply this. Son of a bitch. So 72 times 747, 72 times 747 divided by 48. So the girl should be 1,120 pixels tall. So I'm going to go back into Photoshop. I'm going to grab my ruler tool. I'm going to click on the bottom and drag up, and I'm looking for 1120. Hold down the shift key so it's a direct straight line up. What did I say? 1, 1, 2, 0. Close enough. If you don't want to grab another guideline, you can actually move the one that's sitting on the very top right now. To do that, hit the V key to get the move tool. Actually, we lose the ruler when we do that, so don't do that. Just grab another rule from the top ruler line, drag it down. That's how tall the girl should be when she is back by the mailbox. If you want to get rid of the line that's in the middle because all these lines are beginning to confuse you, then hit the V key to get the move tool. If you hover the cursor over the guideline with the move tool selected, you can click on it and just drag it back up to the menu at the very top. I'm going to click on the girl to transform her now. Command T will actually transform her. I'm going to click on the link between width and height. I'm going to make her much smaller and move her down sort of in place right next to this. Again, kick on it to bring it up a little bit here to make her that. She is now scaled in proportion to the mailbox. However, this had her right up by the reflection in the pond thing. So I'm going to slightly move the anchor point up where I know her vanishing point and horizon line are, pretty much close to her stomach. Hold down the shift key and the option key and click and drag forward to bring her up so that she's scaled correctly so she's close to the pond. Again, she's scaled in proportion now correctly. I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. All of those moves were non-destructive because she is a smart object. Hold down the shift key, click, and drag her back over sort of roughly where she is supposed to be. Then I can get rid of my guidelines up to the view menu, down to guides, down to clear guides. So I'm going to do a snapshot of this right off the bat just to see how different we were from what Evan did in the beginning. So this is how he had her. Again, 3 foot tall girl and our girl right now. Does this make sense, everybody, where we're at right now? Are we good? Okay, I am going to run check layers again now to my actions palette. Again, I'm going to run check layers. I'm going to turn off the color one and turn on the luminosity check layer. So in looking at this right now, she doesn't seem that out of place, but again, the shadows are the biggest issue that we got going here. So, I mean, how deep her shadows are. So again, I'm going to select the girl. I'm going to come up to the image menu, down to mode, down to adjustments, down to shadows and highlights. I'm going to go ahead and say that the lift on this is too much. She's overly brightened in here. So I'm going to drop the amount of this down till I feel like she's in that space a little bit more believable. Again, you've got to ignore these deep shadows in her. We already know that. We're going to lift those anyway. I'm looking at the other parts of her. Is her face matching this? Are her legs matching this part? And so for me, I'm getting down around this roughly, I don't know, 10, 12, somewhere area in here begins to feel more correct to me. I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. Turn off my luminosity check layer, select the shadows and the highlights, mask, and simply invert it as a way to get it on and off. And I'm feeling better about that. I think I maybe have to revisit this a little bit more, but I'm feeling better about that. Really quickly, I am going to open up that part of her body that's in such deep shadow. So with the girl selected, I'm going to add a curve to that. I'm going to change the blending mode of my curve from normal down to luminosity. I'm going to clip that to her. I'm going to then lift the shadows. And again, if you're overlifting, it doesn't matter because I'm going to brush this in slowly on her. Then invert the mask, Command I, grab the B key for a brush. I'm going to change my flow back down to like that 4 or 5% roughly. White is my foreground color. I'm going to make sure it's a very soft brush, maybe a medium hard brush. I still want some control on the brush. Normal blending mode, 100% opacity. I've got a 2% flow. I'm going to bring it up to more like a 4 or 5%. I'm going to zoom in on her body, make my brush a little bit larger, and just start scrubbing in this area to open up the shadows like we did before. Down in her crotch area, under her arm. All of this helps, the part under her neck. All of this will help make the judgment about your luminosity better. So this is the difference that I've got right now. if you feel like you overshot that a little bit, I feel like that seems overshot just a little bit. Instead of trying to rebuild your mask in its entirety, I'm just going to drop it down in opacity down to like an 85%. And this feels better and more correct for me. So then I'm going to go to my color and turn on my color check layers, both of them. And again, I've got the same problem here with her being too blue, with that outfit being too blue in the area that I'm working with. So I'm going to go back down to the luminosity check layer that I was actually working, to the check layer that I was working with before. This will be interesting to see whether it inherits the layer mask for this. It actually might, which is going to cause me problems, but we'll find out right now. So I'm going to add a color balance to this. The color balance comes up, I'm going to clip it down to the image. And when I clip this, again, I'm going to do a wild swing on this just to see. No, it's actually going to impact my whole image. It's not inheriting the layer mask that's controlling the luminosity that's opening up that shadow. So I'm just going to grab the yellow and start to kick it over a little bit. And I'm also going to get rid of some of the cyan. I'm sorry, get rid of some of the, some of the cyan by adding a little bit of red. It's a little too much in there, and that might actually be a little too much yellow. I'm going to check my magenta slider. That magenta slider just takes off way too fast, so I'm not going to touch that guy. I'm going to pretty much leave it right here about where I am right now. If you want the same numbers that I had, I end up with a +4 in the cyan slider and a -10 on the yellow, blue, yellow slider. I'm going to go up to the top and turn off my check layer. And then again, go back down to this adjustment layer and turn it on and off. And she, again, I think she fits the scene better. And then finally, I'm going to do saturation and turn on the saturation check layer. And again, her face is too saturated for this whole scene. So I'm going to add one more adjustment layer, a hue saturation adjustment layer, change its blending mode to saturation only, clip it to the girl. And then targeting adjustment tool, I'm going to simply click on her face and drop it down a little bit more to kill a little bit more of that saturation in her face. Turn off the saturation check layer and then turn on and off my other one. And that feels considerably better to me. Again, I think I've still got a top-down lighting problem, so I'm going to fix that really quick if I can get my stupid brushes to work. But we'll try right now. So I'm going to click on add another curve to this. Change its blending mode to luminosity. Clip the layer to the girl. Drag the midtones down to make everything darker. Then click on my layer mask, invert it, Command I, hit the B key to get a brush. This is where it all went to hell last time. I'm going to drag the flow all the way back up to 100%. I'm going to make it a completely soft brush. And again, I'm going to go to the pasteboard, the F key, and then use the bracket keys to make my brush really big so that, again, the center of the brush is about where her feet are and the top edge of the brush is close to the bottom of her waist. And white is my foreground color. I'm going to click once. And it did that son of a bitch again. So I'm going to fix this in a way that you shouldn't have to fix this. If you take a look, it's put all these tones into gray. So I'm just going to run levels on this to crank this up. And say okay to that. And then go back. And this is now what I've actually got going here. It's actually making the dark part darker. I like that part. This part feels correct for me. However, two things going here. And Jared, this might actually answer part of your question about how to deal with the lemon that you got going. There's water right in front of her. She would be reflected in that water. So if we really want to gild this lily, I'm going to duplicate my composite body. So Command J to duplicate it. It makes another copy of it right here. So I've got two copies of this right now. On this top one, I'm going to flip it. So up to the Edit menu, down to Transform, Flip Vertical. It'll actually make the girl upside down so her feet are where her head is. Hit the V key to get the Move tool and I'm going to drag her down till one foot actually touches the other. This is how reflections would actually work, although you can actually look at the edge line of the pool, and I would actually have to get rid of some of that water because she's not directly on that water. However, her other foot is not touching as well, and it actually would. So again, Command T to transform it. It's going to say it wants to turn off all your smart objects. That's okay. I'm going to grab the anchor point and put it on the one foot that's actually aligned. So those 2 feet on the right side are touching, but now I can use the rotate tool on the other side to actually get those other feet to touch. So I've got both of those going right now. So that's going to be my transform. However, if we go in and take a quick look at this, again, you don't have water going all the way back, so I'm going to put a layer mask on this, I'm going to put a layer mask on the composite that is reflecting her upside down, so it's this one right here. I'm going to add a layer mask to that. I'm going to hit it with a brush, the B key, make it a much smaller brush. I'm going to just do this by hand, but typically I would go in and make a selection of the water to actually do this work. Hit the X key to make black my foreground color, change my flow up to 100%, make my brush edge medium hardness so that I've got a little bit more control about it. And I am going to get rid of that part of the reflection of the girl in the water and this part as well. And then finally, I'm going to lower the opacity of that reflection considerably. And this is what I've added. However, it makes things more believable. Again, if I had shadows underneath her feet, all of that would help. Final thing I'm going to do in this, and it's the one last thing, and we've got 6 minutes to get this done, and this will actually be a game changer. The problem that I have with this now is depth of field. Again, if you were focused on this girl, there is no way those trees in the background would be that sharp. So what a lot of people will do is they'll simply put a blur on this. However, blurs on this do not necessarily explain what we really want to do. What we would really like to do is push this through a system that recreates the way light and focus work inside a real camera lens. And there is actually a thing in Photoshop that will do this. However, it's tricky to work with. So I'm going to just run it by you really quickly, and then we'll do another version of it next week. I'm going to hit the F key to get back to the pasteboard and to get back to my original where I needed to actually be, to get the little stoplights back. I'm going to double click on the hand to get all the way back here. So the first thing we need to do is create what is called a depth map. So to do this, I'm going to go up to the very top of my visible layer. So I've got my adjustment layers are right here. I need a merged version of all of this. Unfortunately, the lens filter does not work on smart objects. I need all of this to be one single image right now. So let's say I'm happy with the lighting, I'm happy with lifting the shadows, I'm happy with the reflections, I'm happy with everything. So I'm selecting my top layer. I'm going to do a merge stamp version of all of this. Command, Option, Shift, and the letter E will make a merge stamp version of this. And this is going to be my depth of field. So I'm just going to call it DOF. Then to make the map that we need to use this, come back down to the girl. I need the figure here, the composite body 2. Come all the way back down to this part right here. We need to do load this as a selection. So hover over the thumbnail of the smart object, hold down the Command key and click. It loads this as a selection. You need to save this. So up to the select menu, come down to save selection, and I'm just going to call this body. And say OK to that. Command D to deselect. I am going to pull down another guideline because there's something that's going to disappear for us in a second. So I'm going to pull down a guideline right at her feet. This is where my plane of focus I want it to be. I want it to start at her feet. Anything in front of her feet should be softer, and anything behind her should also be softer. But right on that plane should be what I'm looking for here. I'm going to go back up now to my merged version of all of this. I'm going to select on this to make the merged depth of field layer active. I'm going to add then an adjustment layer on top of this. So click on adjustment layer, and we are going to add a gradient, not a gradient map like you do to change color, but a gradient. When the gradient dialog box opens up, you will actually get a way in here that you can modify your gradient. What do we want? So in the drop-down menu for the type of gradient, it inherits what we had in the regular options menu. We need to change this. So I'm going to go back to the basics panel. I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to change this gradient. In my case, it's foreground to background works because my foreground and background colors are black and white. But if they were not, you can actually click on the third one over, which is simply black to white, and you'll see that your image becomes black to white. I'm going to click outside. Don't say OK yet. I'm going to simply click to the right side of this to get rid of this part. I'm going to change the style of my gradient from linear to reflected. And when you do reflected, what you end up with is a gradient that's now going from white to black, back to white again. You can control how deep that gradient is. What we're building in our gradient map is we're going to say, anything in our gradient map that is black will be in focus. Anything that is white will be out of focus. And our transition from in focus to out of focus are these grays that are in between. So my gradient is too big, so I need to actually scale it smaller. So I'm going to hover over the scale and simply drop it down to make it a tighter gradient. Then if I come out actually onto my image, you can move this thing up and down. So I'm going to move the sharpest of the focus, the blackest of this black, is going to go right on that blue line that I said I wanted to do. I'm going to leave the rest of this gradient the way it is. Some people would make it a little bit smaller. They would scale it down a little bit tighter. I'm going to leave it the way it is right now, and I'm going to say OK to that. Then I'm going to add a blank layer on top of this. So just come down and add a brand new blank layer. Trust me, we are almost done. In this blank layer, I'm going to load the selection of the body. So I'm going to come back to my channels palette, hover over the body, command click to load that as a selection. I'm going to come back to my layer part right here, and I need to fill this with black as well because the girl needs to be black. She needs to be in focus. So black is my foreground color. Option delete fills it. Command D to deselect. This is my gradient map. This is now going to tell Photoshop what should be in focus and what should be softer and not in focus. However, I need to save it as a gradient map. So if you come up, select any of your RGB channels, it doesn't matter which one, and simply duplicate it by dragging it down to make a copy of it. And I'm going to double click on that red copy and name it depth map. And say OK to that. Then I'm going to throw away this layer number 1 and the gradient map as well. They've done their work. We don't need them any longer. So, final thing right here, how to run this filter, how to use it. So with our depth of field, the whole pulled together version of this, come up to the filter menu, come down to blur, and come over to lens blur. So this is an incredibly intensive, processor intensive thing. You can see mine's taking forever to actually draw. When it opens up, you have in your instance right here, you have a drop-down menu for your depth map. If you click on that drop-down menu, you can go to depth map itself. Once you click on depth map, you'll actually see that the girl is sharp. The background is actually out of focus. We can change where this all happens. See where this thing that says set focal point? I'm going to make my blur really strong first, though. The amount of blur is controlled by the radius. So if we click our radius and drag it really up high, you can see it really blurs everything. If you click your set focal point and you come back to the woods, so I'm clicking on my set focal point, I'm going to click on the woods get focused and the girl gets softened. If I click on the girl is in focus. So this is working the way a true lens works. So you can see you have control about what kind of lens you're actually using. You can actually change the curvature of the aperture blades in here. You can set the rotation. You can actually change the number of blades of your aperture. So if you look at an aperture, most Canon apertures right now have a 6 or an 8 blade setup. In other lenses, they'll have more or less. You can completely build this as a custom lens. But this is actually doing blurs the way they actually happen in a lens. Now, this is too strong, so I'm going to drop my radius. I just wanted to show you guys what that was. I'm going to pull my radius back down. Again, there is a preview on here that you can use to turn on and off. And just that subtle amount. I've got a radius of 13. I actually think it needs to be a little bit higher. And I'm going to say OK to that. This image now is the way it would have really been shot. Look at the difference. No, this is insane. This is worth the price of admission. Are there questions about this?
My focus.
I will see you guys next week, and we will do more of this next week. So anyway, your focus is show me.
Yeah, it's not click.
All right, so right now you don't have a depth map loaded. You have to have the depth map.
Oh, sorry, I forgot that.
But I'm going to be here closing this down, so take your time, build your depth map, and then let's take a look at it. Jobella, did you have a question? Let me stop the video recording really quickly, guys, and then we'll